I was sent to take his life, but I ended up giving him mine. The silver wolf's paws didn't make a sound against the ash covered floor of the dead thicket. Zara stayed low, her belly fur brushing against jagged, frozen roots that felt like the teeth of the earth. She was starving, but the hunger gnawing at her ribs wasn't entirely her own. Every time her stomach cramped, she felt a secondary, sharper pang, the phantom hunger of her twin sister, Zaya. Thump, thump. The pulse of Zaya's heart vibrated through Zara's chest, a frantic, irregular beat. It told her the Vulture King was near the cages again. Zara squeezed her eyes shut, a low, pained whine vibrating in her throat. Without warning, a sharp, stinging heat flared across her left shoulder. She hadn't been hit, but she gasped as the sensation registered. A whip. Ah, he's using the lash on her again. Focus! Zara hissed to her inner wolf, her claws digging into the soot. If she didn't bring back meat, the king wouldn't feed Zaya. Worse, if she didn't find the Alpha's trail, he would break her sister's legs just to hear the sound. Truth be told, Zara felt more like a ghost than a wolf lately. She was a weapon, forged in the fires of someone else's pain. Soon after, she caught a scent that didn't belong in this graveyard of trees. It was rich, like cedar wood and rain-drenched earth, cutting through the rot of the thicket. It was a scent that promised life. For an assassin, it was the scent of a target. Maybe it was fate or maybe it was a curse, but the smell made her wolf stir with a strange, forbidden curiosity. Zara's golden eyes locked onto a massive paw print in the mud. It was twice the size of hers. Malachi, the Titan Alpha of the Obsidian Crags. Deep down, she knew the truth. She was overmatched. But then she thought of Zaya's cage. Because of that, fear wasn't an option. She had to kill a god to save a girl. As the wind shifted, the scent grew thicker. It was intoxicating. In the span of a breath, the borrowed pain from her sister faded, replaced by a honey-thick warmth. It was a sub-hook in her soul she didn't understand. Why did her target smell like home? Not only that, but the forest grew silent as if the trees themselves were bowing. Zara crept forward, her muscles coiled like a spring. What followed was a glimpse of shadow moving through the mist, a black coat so dark it swallowed the moonlight. She held her breath, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Would she strike now? Or would her heart betray her mission before the first drop of blood fell? Next, Zara tracked the shadow towards the edge of the crags where the air grew thin and cold. Her breath came in ragged puffs of silver. She was a shadow among shadows, yet she felt a strange pull toward the mountain peaks. It was as if a string was tied to her heart, tugging her toward the very man she was supposed to destroy. Moments later, she reached a clearing where the black wolf stood. He was magnificent. His fur was like obsidian, and his presence felt like a mountain standing tall against the sky. He wasn't just an alpha, he was a force of nature. Zara felt her wolf pressed forward, wanting to howl in recognition rather than snarl in hate. Do it now, she whispered to herself, her voice a mere tremor in the wind. She adjusted her grip on the frozen earth. She was a lethal assassin for the High Council of Elders, trained to ignore the heart. Yet the closer she got, the louder the silence roared in her ears. As her wolf stirred, she realized Malachi wasn't alone. He was looking at the moon, his head tilted as if listening to a secret. In that moment, Zara saw the scars on his flank. They weren't from battle. They looked like the same marks the Vulture King left on the outcasts. Was he a victim too? The thought was a plot twist she hadn't prepared for. Still, she couldn't hesitate. To make things worse, she felt Zaya's fear spike through the bond, a cold, sharp needle in her brain. The king was losing patience. If Zara didn't return with proof of Malachi's death, Zaya would be the one to pay. Because of that, Zara bared her fangs, the silver in her coat shimmering like a blade. Without another word, she prepared to lunge, but then Malachi turned his head. He didn't look startled. He looked waiting. The moment their eyes locked, Zara's world tilted. His eyes weren't the eyes of a monster. They were gold, pure, molten gold that seemed to see right through her fur to the shattered girl beneath. Time stood still. She saw his nostrils flare as he took in her scent. Something inside her shifted, a tectonic plate of her soul moving into a new position. In a single heartbeat, the world shifted. Her heart skipped. Was he smelling her, or was he smelling the fate that bound them? She didn't know what scared her more, the Vulture King's wrath or the way Malachi looked at her. Rather than attacking, he sat back on his haunches. He let out a low, rumbling sound, not a growl, but a call. A beat later, Zara felt her own throat vibrating in response. Between them, something cracked. The air thickened with a heat that had nothing to do with the sun. In the stillness that followed, Zara stayed frozen, her claws still extended. She was a hair's breadth from leaping, but her body moved on instinct, refusing to kill. How could she strike the only creature who made the world feel warm? It was a question that haunted her even as she tried to summon her rage. In fact, the heat between them was becoming unbearable. It was like fire blooming beneath her skin. As the mark tingled on her shoulder, the one she'd had since birth, she realized it was glowing. Her soul answered his call before her mind could protest. The space between them burned with an invisible electricity. "Who are you?" She wanted to ask, but wolves have no words for such things. Instead, she let out a short, sharp bark of confusion. Malachi stepped forward, his movements fluid and regal. With every step he took, Zara felt her resolve crumbling like dry clay. What's worse, the Vulture King's voice echoed in her head, a dark subplot of her reality. Kill him, or she dies. The conflict was a jagged edge in her chest. She stood between the life of her sister and the soul of her mate. No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't see a way to save both. After that, Malachi reached the center of the clearing. He shifted. The transformation was romantic and intense, a blur of muscle and bone cracking into human form. He stood tall, naked, and unashamed in the moonlight. His skin was bronze, and his hair was as dark as his wolf. "I know why you are here, little shadow." His voice hung in the air, and deep and resonant like a cello. "You were sent to take my life." Zara's breath caught. She shifted back as well, her human skin feeling raw and exposed against the biting cold. She stood before him, her silver hair falling over her shoulders. She felt it, etched in fire, the bond pulsing between them. It was a sub-hook that pulled her closer against her will. "You should kill me then," she whispered, her voice trembling, "because if I don't kill you, they will kill her." Under the weight of his stare, Zara felt completely seen. Malachi didn't reach for a weapon. Instead, he reached for her. Before she could move, his hand cupped her cheek. His touch was electric, a searing brand of belonging. "Let them try," he growled, his golden eyes blazing with a predatory intensity. "But know this. Once I claim you, not even death can take you back." As the sky darkened, a new shadow emerged from the trees. A scout from the Vulture King. The loop was closing. The scouts saw them together, which meant the war had already begun. The tension broke as Malachi pulled her against his chest, shielding her from the forest's prying eyes. Zara was trapped in the arms of her target, and for the first time in her life, she didn't want to be anywhere else. I was sent to take his life, but I ended up giving him mine. The air in the clearing turned to ice the second the scout's scent hit Zara's nose. It was the smell of old blood and rot, the signature of the Vulture King's army. Before she could move, Malachi's arm tightened around her waist like a band of iron. She felt his heart thundering against her back, but it wasn't fear. It was a rhythmic call to war. Run! Zara choked out, her voice barely a thread in the wind. She knew that if the scout made it back to the dead thicket, Zaya was as good as dead. Because of that, every muscle in her body screamed for her to shift and strike. Still, she was pinned against Malachi's chest, paralyzed by the heat of the bond that sizzled wherever their skin met. Soon after, a low, guttural snarl erupted from the shadows. The scout, a mangy wolf with missing fur and yellowed fangs, stepped into the moonlight. He didn't attack. Instead, he let out a short, mocking yip that sent a wave of cold terror through Zara's spine. She felt Zaya's pain flare in the back of her mind, a sharp, psychic prick that meant the king was already punishing her for the delay. He knows, Zara whispered, her eyes wide with horror. Malachi. He knows I didn't kill you. What followed was a blur of motion so fast the eye could barely track it. Malachi didn't shift back into a wolf. Rather, he used his human strength, launching himself forward with the grace of a panther. He caught the scout by the throat before the creature could turn to flee. The sound of snapping bone echoed through the silent trees, a final, brutal punctuation mark to the scout's life. Truth be told, Zara had never seen such raw power. Malachi dropped the lifeless wolf into the snow, his eyes still glowing like twin suns. He turned back to her, his chest heaving. In that moment, the choice was no longer about a mission. It was about survival. The king will send more, Malachi growled, his voice vibrating deep in his lungs. You cannot go back there, little shadow. No matter how hard she tried, Zara couldn't stop the tears from blurring her vision. She looked at her hands, the hands that were supposed to be covered in his blood. Instead, they were trembling with a desperate, forbidden love. Because she was a twin, she felt her sister's life force fading with every second she stayed in his arms. I have to, she cried, the words tearing at her throat. My sister, he has her. Before the words left her lips, Malachi was in front of her again. He didn't use force this time. Rather, he tilted her chin up, forcing her to look into the gold of his eyes. As the silence roared around them, she felt his resolve pouring into her through the touch. We will save her, he promised, the words etched in fire. But if you go back now, he will kill you both to spite me. You stay in the crags. You stay with me. By the time they reached the heart of the Obsidian Crags, the moon was high and silver. The path was a jagged staircase of black rock that felt like climbing into the heavens themselves. Zara moved like a puppet on strings, her thoughts spinning in a dark circle of guilt and longing. She was entering the lion's den, but for the first time in years, the air felt clean enough to breathe. Moments later, they stood before a massive archway carved directly into the mountainside. There were no doors, only the vast, echoing silence of the stone. Malachi led her inside, his hand never leaving hers. The interior was lit by low burning braziers that smelled of pine and sweet resin. It was beautiful. It was a palace. It was a sanctuary. This is where you will stay, Malachi said, gesturing to a room filled with thick furs and a view of the stars. Yet Zara couldn't bring herself to sit. She paced the length of the stone floor, her human feet feeling the smooth, cold surface. She felt like a traitor in a sanctuary. Because of that, she couldn't look him in the eye. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice echoing off the walls. "I came to murder you. I am an assassin. I am the enemy." As the wind shifted outside, Molokai stepped into the light of a brazier. The flickering flames danced across the scars on his chest. Scars that Zara now realized matched the ones on her own soul. He didn't look like a titan. He looked like a man who had been lonely for a very long time. "The bond doesn't lie," he said softly. "I felt your heart the moment you entered my woods. It wasn't full of hate. It was full of grief." She didn't know what scared her more, his kindness or the way her wolf wanted to crawl into his lap and stay there forever. Deep down, she knew the truth. She was falling for the man she was born to break. It was a subplot of her life that threatened to destroy everything. Because she loved him, she was becoming the very traitor she feared. "You don't understand," Zara whispered, leaning her head against the cool stone wall. "The Vulture King. He won't stop. He will burn these mountains to the ground to get what he wants." More importantly, she felt Zaya's presence in her mind growing faint, as if her sister was slipping into a forced sleep. The psychic link was a heavy chain. Every minute Zara spent in comfort felt like a lash across Zaya's back. That night, sleep was a stranger to Zara. She lay on the furs, eye watching the shadows dance on the ceiling. Every heartbeat was a reminder of the ticking clock. Without warning, the mark on her shoulder began to burn, not with pain, but with an intense, pulsing heat. It was as if summoned by her distress, Malachi appeared in the doorway. "You aren't sleeping," he noted, his voice a low purr that made her skin tingle. He walked to the edge of the furs and sat down. The space between them burned with a renewed intensity. Zara sat up, her hair falling over her face. She felt a desperate need to be close to him, a hunger that was growing more powerful than her fear. "I can't," she admitted, her voice a whisper. "I can feel her, Malachi. She's so cold." Without thinking, Malachi reached out and pulled her into his lap. Zara froze for a heartbeat, then melted against him. His warmth was like a sun, unbanishing the shadows of the dead thicket. Her bones remembered him from a life before this one. Her soul answered his before she could find the words to stop it. "I will call the packs," Malachi vowed, his chin resting on the top of her head. "We will gather at the border by dawn. We will hunt the vulture together." What followed was a moment of pure, unadulterated passion. Malachi tilted her head back, his golden eyes searching hers. The air thickened until it was impossible to breathe. Between them, something cracked, the last of Zara's resistance. Because he was her mate, her body no longer obeyed her mind. The moment their eyes locked, her world tilted. It wasn't just a kiss, it was a claim. It was the sealing of a fate that had been written in the stars long before they were born. As fire bloomed beneath her skin, Zara realized she was no longer an assassin. She was Malachi's mate. But as she pulled away, gasping for air, a new sensation hit her. It was a sharp, sudden nausea that made her stomach turn. It wasn't hunger. It was something deeper, something life-changing. "Zara?" Malachi asked, his brow furrowing with concern. She looked at him, her heart skipping a beat. The open loop of her destiny was beginning to close. She felt a tiny, flickering spark of life deep inside her, a second heartbeat that wasn't Zaya's. Because of this new life, she knew the war was no longer just about a sister. I think, she started, her voice trembling with a mix of joy and terror. I think the mission is over. As the sky darkened before the dawn, Zara realized the stakes had just tripled. She wasn't just fighting for her sister anymore. She was carrying the heir to the Obsidian throne, and the Vulture King would do anything to tear it from her. I was sent to take his life, but I ended up giving him mine. The first light of dawn crawled over the jagged peaks of the Obsidian crags, but Zara felt no warmth from its touch. She stood by the window of the high stone chamber, her fingers tracing the rough-hewn walls that felt more like a prison than a palace. Because she was a stranger in this land of giants, every shadow in the corner looked like a hidden blade. Still, the air here was sweet with the scent of pine and fresh snow, a sharp contrast to the suffocating rot of her past life. You should eat, a voice rumbled from the doorway. Zara didn't need a turn to know it was Malachi. His presence was a heavy, magnetic pull that made her heart hammer against her ribs. He walked toward her, his bare feet silent on the stone floor, carrying a wooden bowl filled with roasted meat and wild berries. I'm not hungry, Zara whispered, though her stomach betrayed her with a sharp, hollow cramp. Truth be told, her body was struggling to process the peace of this place, while her mind was still trapped in the dead thicket. Because her wolf was restless, she could feel the phantom lash of her sister's whip across her own skin. As the silence stretched, she felt Malachi's heat radiating behind her, a protective wall that she wasn't sure she deserved. Soon after, Malachi placed the bowl on a low table and stepped into her personal space. He didn't touch her, but the air thickened with a sub-hook of desire that made her skin tingle. She was a lethal assassin for the High Council of Elders, yet in his presence, she felt like a trembling leaf. Deep down, she knew the truth. Her wolf was already kneeling to him, even if her mind was still standing guard. Your sister's pain is quiet today, Malachi noted, his golden eyes searching her face for any sign of the sensation mirror's toll. Maybe it is fate's way of letting me rest. Zara sighed, leaning her head against the cool window frame. Or maybe the king is just saving his strength for the kill. Next, the tension in the room became too much to bear, so Malachi led her out into the wild heart of the crags. He didn't speak as they descended the rocky paths, but his hand stayed firmly on the small of her back. They reached a wide, hidden valley where the grass was a vibrant emerald green beneath the melting frost. Without a word, Malachi shifted. His body was a blur of obsidian fur and rippling muscle as he became the Titan wolf once more. Run with me, his voice echoed in her mind, a psychic command that felt like a caress. Zara didn't hesitate. Her body moved on instinct as she shed her human skin, her bones cracking and reforming into the sleek silver shape of her wolf. In a single heartbeat, the world shifted. Her senses exploded. The smell of damp earth, the sound of a distant hawk, and the electric hum of the bond pulsing between her and the black wolf. Because of this bond, her movements became fluid. What followed was a dance of power and grace as they tore across the valley floor. Malachi pushed her, his massive frame a shadow that she struggled to keep up with. Not only that, but for the first time in years, Zara felt the joy of the hunt without the weight of a mission. She lunged and snapped at the air, her silver fur catching the sunlight like a polished mirror. Eventually, they reached a high ridge overlooking the entire Obsidian territory. Malachi stopped, his chest heaving as he stared out over his kingdom. Zara stood beside him, her tongue lolling out in a wolfish grin. She was a twin. She was a killer. She was a mate. But then, the wind shifted, carrying a scent that made her hackles rise, the sharp, metallic tang of an intruder. They are watching us, Zara growled through the bond, her golden eyes scanning the tree line below. The outcasts. They are already circling the crags. Moments later, they returned to the main settlement, but the peace of the valley was quickly shattered. A group of pack warriors stood in their path, their hackles raised and their eyes full of suspicion. To make things worse, the lead warrior, a scarred female with ice blue eyes, stepped forward with a snarl that echoed off the stone walls. The shadow wolf does not belong here, Alpha, the warrior barked, her voice a whip crack of defiance. She carries the scent of the vulture king. She is a plague brought into our home. Zara felt her wolf stir with a primal rage, a growl rising deep in her throat. No matter how hard she tried to be invisible, the pack could smell the blood in her paws. Because she was an assassin, she knew how to kill them all. Because she was a mate, she stayed her claws. Because she was a mother, she feared their judgment. The conflict was a jagged blade in her chest, tearing at her new sense of belonging. She is mine, Malachi roared, his human voice returning as he shifted back with a violent intensity. He stood between Zara and his warriors, his bronze skin glistening with sweat. Any challenge to her is a challenge to me. Do you wish to bleed today, Vane? As the tension broke, the warriors lowered their heads in a forced submission. Yet the air remained heavy with a lingering question. Zara stood behind her mate, her silver hair tangled and her heart racing. She felt it, etched in fire, the moment Vane's eyes met hers. It wasn't just hate. It was a promise of a future betrayal. They will never see me as one of them, Zara whispered as the warriors dispersed. Rather than answering, Malachi turned and pulled her into a fierce embrace. The space between them burned with a desperate need for connection. He tucked her head under his chin, his heart beat a steady, rhythmic drum against her ear. It was a shelter. It was a fortress. It was a home. You are more than a pack member, he murmured, his breath warm against her temple. You are the mother of the air. You are the heartbeat of these mountains. As the sky darkened, Zara felt a sudden, sharp flutter deep in her womb, a spark of life that made her breath catch. The open loop of her destiny was tightening. She was no longer just a twin or a killer. She was the vessel for a new world, and the war to protect it was only just beginning. The sunrise over the Obsidian Crags was a bleeding gash of orange and gold, but Zara could only focus on the bitter salt of the air. She stood on the high balcony, her hand resting protectively over the slight curve of her stomach. The morning sickness had passed, yet a new heavier weight settled in her chest. Because the pack elders were gathered in the hall below, she felt like a rabbit cornered by a dozen hungry wolves. They won't accept me, Malachi, Zara whispered, her voice caught in the wind. She didn't have to turn around to know he was there. His scent, cedar and thunder, arrived a heartbeat before his touch. Without thinking, she leaned back into his warmth, seeking the only anchor she had left in this shifting world. Soon after, Malachi's large hands covered hers, his heat seeping through her thin tunic. He was a pillar of strength, a titan who had never known the shame of being a tool for a monster. Yet Zara could feel the tension in his muscles. Not only that, but the psychic bond with Zaya was pulsing with a rhythmic, dull ache, a sign that the Vulture King was growing impatient for his prize. Because she was tied to her twin, Zara felt the shadow of his wings even in the sunlight. They will accept what I command, Malachi growled, his voice a low rumble against her hair. You are my mate. You carry the future of this lineage. What followed was a moment of agonizing silence. Zara turned in his arms, her golden eyes searching his. She wanted to believe him. More importantly, she needed to know that his love was stronger than his duty to a pack that viewed her as a poisoned blade. Still, the doubt was a subplot that whispered in the back of her mind, reminding her that she was an assassin first and a mother second. They smell the dead thicket on me, she said, her chest aching. Every time I walk past them, they see the silver of a killer, not the gold of a Luna. Truth be told, she wasn't just afraid for herself. If the pack rejected her, the child would be born an outcast, a hybrid with nowhere to call home. Because of that fear, Zara pulled away, her body moving on instinct toward the edge of the stone railing. She felt the urge to shift, to run, to hide the air in the deepest cave where no one could find them. Next, the meeting with the elders became a trial by fire. The air in the great hall thickened until the lungs burned with the scent of challenge and old blood. Zara sat on the stone throne beside Malachi, her knuckles white as she gripped the armrests. Beside her, Malachi was a statue of obsidian. He was a leader, he was a warrior, he was a king. She is a shadow wolf, the oldest elder hissed, his eyes milky with age but sharp with spite. She was sent to spill your blood, and now you ask us to bow to her seed? In a single heartbeat, the world shifted. Zara felt a sudden, sharp kick in her womb, the first sign of the life within. And it was a jolt of pure energy that sent a wave of golden light through the sensation mirror. Miles away, Zaya gasped in her cage, her own body reacting to the surge of the shadow air's power. Because of this new life, Zara felt a strength she had never known. The child is mine, Malachi roared, the sound echoing off the high ceilings like a physical blow, and the mother is your queen. Before the words left his lips, the great hall's heavy stone doors burst open. A warrior stumbled in, his fur matted with ash and his side torn open by jagged claws. What followed was a message that changed everything. The warrior collapsed at the foot of the dais, his breath a wet, rattling sound in the sudden silence. The vulture! The warrior choked out, his eyes wide with a terror that Zara knew too well. He is no longer at the border. He has crossed the crags. He has the twin. He uses her as a beacon. Moments later, Zara's world tilted into a dark vortex of realization. The Vulture King wasn't just attacking, he was using the bond as a tracking device. Because Zaya felt everything Zara felt, the king could follow the scent of Zara's joy and Malachi's power directly to their doorstep. He was coming for her. He was coming for the child. He was coming for the crown. He's using her as a human shield, Zara whispered, her voice a ghost of itself. He knows I won't strike if she's in the line of fire. No matter how hard she tried, Zara couldn't move. She stood in the dais, watching her mate prepare to fight a battle she had brought to his door. She felt like a contagion, a sickness that had infected the only place she ever felt safe. Because of that guilt, her wolf pressed forward, demanding to fight for the sister who was being dragged through the dirt. I won't hide, Zara said, her voice trembling but firm. He is coming for me. If I stay in the caves, I am just a trapped bird waiting for the cat. What followed was the sound of 1,000 wolves roaring outside the hall. The Vulture King's army had arrived, a sea of mangy, broken creatures that moved like a wave of gray death. Zara felt it, etched in fire, the moment Zaya entered the Obsidian territory. The pain was unbearable, a psychic scream that tore through the bond and left Zara on her knees. Zaya! Zara screamed, her hands clutching her head. Through the bond, she saw the Vulture King's face, a twisted mask of rot and greed. He was holding Zaya by the throat at the base of the mountain. He didn't want the land. He didn't want the pack. He wanted the air. As the silence roared in the hall, Zara looked at Malachi. The space between them burned with a new, terrible understanding. She had to go out there. She had to face him. She had to end it. The stone walls of the great hall felt like they were closing in on Zara. Outside, the howling of the Vulture King's army was a rhythmic chant of death that shook the very foundation of the mountains. Malachi stood by the heavy oak doors, his back to her, his muscles rippling under his skin as he prepared to shift. Because he was an alpha, his instinct was to lock her away in the safety of the deep caves. "You are not going out there, Zara," Malachi growled, the sound vibrating through the stone floor. "I will not risk the air. I will not risk you." Soon after, Zara stepped forward, her silver hair whipping around her face like a storm cloud. She didn't feel like a rabbit anymore. Rather, she felt the burning fire of a mother whose nest was under threat. Truth be told, she knew Malachi was trying to protect her, but his protection felt like a different kind of cage. "She is my sister, Malachi!" Zara screamed, her voice cracking the heavy silence of the hall. "Every lash he gives her, I feel. Every breath she gasps, I choke on. Because of the bond, I am already on that battlefield. You can't keep me here." What followed was a moment of pure, raw tension. Malachi turned, his golden eyes blazing with a predatory intensity that would have made any other wolf cower. Still, Zara didn't flinch. She stood her ground, her hand resting over her womb, where the shadow air pulsed with a golden light. She was a weapon. She was a mate. She was a protector. "If you go out there, he will use your love against you," Malachi hissed, stepping into her space until their chests nearly touched. "And if I stay here, I will die of a broken heart before the sun sets," Zara countered, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. No matter how hard she tried to be the submissive mate, her wolf pressed forward, demanding to lead. Without thinking, she reached out and grabbed Malachi's forearm. Her touch was electric, a searing reminder of the fated bond that tied them. In that moment, she wasn't asking for permission. She was stating a fact. Next, the descent into the shadow began in earnest. By the time the sun dipped behind the jagged peaks, Zara was moving down the secret mountain paths. She had waited for Malachi to lead the main charge before slipping away through the shadows. She moved with the silent grace of the assassin she used to be. Because she knew the Vulture King's tactics, she didn't take the main road. Instead, she moved through the whistling ravine, a narrow crack in the stone where the wind screamed like a dying animal. Moments later, the scent of rot and old blood became overwhelming. She reached a ledge overlooking the base of the mountain. Below her, the two armies were locked in a brutal primal struggle. It was a sea of black fur. It was a sea of gray fur. It was a sea of blood. Even so, Zara's eyes were locked on a single spot in the center of the carnage. The Vulture King sat upon a throne made of bleached bones, his mangy, feather-like fur matted with filth. Beside him, Avaziah was chained to a heavy stone pillar. She looked like a ghost, her skin pale and her eyes vacant. Because of the bond, Zara felt the cold, numbing despair radiating from her twin. It was a heavy chain that threatened to pull them both into the abyss. I see you, little shadow. The king's voice boomed inside Zara's head, a dark psychic intrusion that made her stumble. What followed was a wave of nausea so strong Zara fell to her knees. It wasn't just the pregnancy, it was the king's mental lash. He was reaching through Zaya to get to her. He was twisting the bond, turning their greatest strength into a lethal weakness. Come down and save her, the king taunted, his laughter a raspy sound that echoed in the ravine. Give me the child, and I will let the weakling go. As the silence roared in her ears, Zara made her choice. She couldn't wait for Malachi's reinforcements. She couldn't wait for a better plan. Without another word, she shifted into her silver wolf form. The transformation was a blur of agonizing heat and snapping bone, her silver fur shimmering like a blade under the rising moon. She was no longer afraid. Because she carried the air, she felt a secondary source of power blooming beneath her skin. It was a golden fire that she channeled into her paws as she leaped from the ledge. She didn't fall, she soared. She hunted, she didn't think twice. What's worse, the king was ready for her. As she landed in the center of the clearing, his broken ones circled her, their yellow eyes full of hunger. Zara bared her fangs, a terrifying, guttural growl erupting from her throat. She was a queen defending her throne. She was a sister defending her blood. And she was a wolf defending her soul. Let her go! Zara snarled through the psychic link, her voice a thunderclap that made the smaller wolves flinch. Rather than obeying, the king stood up, his massive, twisted claws glinting in the moonlight. He stepped toward Zaya, his shadow falling over her like a shroud. Before she could move, he pressed a claw against Zaya's throat. A single drop of crimson blood bloomed against the pale skin. In that moment, Zara's world tilted. The bond exploded with Zaya's sharp, stinging terror. Between one breath and the next, Zara realized that the Vulture King didn't want a deal. He wanted a sacrifice. He wanted to break Zara's heart so he could claim her power for himself. One step closer and she dies, the king whispered, his eyes locked on Zara's silver form. The tension broke as a massive black shape erupted from the tree line behind the king. It was Malachi. He had seen her leap. He had followed her into the mouth of the beast. The space between them burned with his fury and his love. Zara felt her heart skip a beat. The point of no return had passed. They were either going to save the twin, or they were all going to die in the ash of the dead thicket. The scent of blood and ash filled Zara's nose as she stood in the center of the Vulture King's circle. Because she was a silver wolf against 100 mangy rogues, she knew her odds were non-existent. Still, she didn't look at the snarling wolves. Rather, her eyes were fixed on Malachi, who was a blur of black fur and rage as he tore through the king's front line. Soon after, the Vulture King let out a high-pitched and screeching howl that made the ground tremble. It wasn't a call for more soldiers. Instead, it was a signal for the broken ones to step back. What followed was a moment of terrifying clarity. Zara felt a cold, oily sensation wash over her skin. Because of the bond, she felt Zaya's mind suddenly open wide, but it wasn't her sister inside. It is a hollow, dark void. You thought the bond was a bridge. The king's voice hissed through Zaya's pale lips, a subhook of horror that made Zara's blood run cold. In a single heartbeat, the world shifted. Zara felt her strength begin to drain, not out of her body, but out of her soul. The king wasn't just using Zaya as a shield, he was using her as a siphon. He was pulling the golden light of the shadow air through the twin bond, feeding on the life force of Zara's unborn child. Because she loved her sister, she couldn't close the door. Because she was a mother, she was being emptied from the inside out. Malachi! Zara screamed through the link, but her voice was a faint whisper. What's worse, Malachi had been intercepted. A dozen rogues had thrown themselves at him, not to kill him, but to pin him down. He roared, his massive obsidian paws crushing bone and tearing flesh. Yet for everyone he killed, two more took its place. He was a god in chains, and Zara was a queen being bled dry. Next, the descent into despair became a physical weight. Zara shifted back into her human form, her legs giving way as the golden light around her belly began to flicker and fade. She crawled toward Zaya, her fingers clawing at the dirt. She felt like a shell. She felt like a ghost. She felt like a failure. Even so, she reached out, wanting to touch her sister one last time. Zaya, please. Zara wheezed, her vision tunneling into darkness. Before she could move, the king stepped off his throne of bones. He walked toward her with a predatory grace, his mangy fur bristling with the power he was stealing. Moments later, he stood over her, his shadow swallowing her whole. Truth be told, Zara had never felt so small. Because she had chosen love, she had provided the king with the very weapon he needed to destroy the Obsidian Pack. You gave me everything, little shadow, the king mocked, his eyes glowing with a sickly violet light. To make things worse, a figure emerged from the shadows behind the king. It was Vane, the scarred female warrior from Malachi's pack. She didn't look like a prisoner, rather, she looked like a partner. She stood beside the king, her ice blue eyes full of a triumphant spite that cut deeper than any claw. The pack belongs to the strong, not the fated, Vane spat, her voice a whip crack of betrayal. As the silence roared, Zara realized the depth of the trap. Vane had been the one to guide the Vulture King through the mountain passes. She had traded the Alpha's heir for a seat at the king's right hand. Between them, something cracked, the last shred of Zara's hope. She looked at Malachi, who was now pinned to the ground, his golden eyes wide with an agonizing, silent scream as he watched the life leave her face. That night, the moon seemed to weep as it watched the fall of the Obsidian Queen. Zara lay in the dirt, her heart beating so slowly she could count the seconds between pulses. The bond was silent. Zaya's eyes were blank, and the air was quiet. Because the king had taken the light, there was only the cold, biting dark of the dead thicket left inside her. Looking back, I should have known, Zara whispered to the empty air, her voice a ghost of a ghost. What would you have done in my place? Would you have stayed in the cage? Without warning, the Vulture King leaned down and gripped her chin. His touch was like rot, a searing brand of filth that made her want to vomit. But she had no strength left to fight. She was a broken weapon. She was a mother without a child. She was a mate without a pack. I will take the child now, the king whispered, his hand moving toward her stomach. In that moment, Zara's world tilted into utter despair. She felt her internal flaw, her belief that she was only a tool for others, reach its peak. She was nothing, She had brought death to the man she loved and a curse to the sister she tried to save. As the king's claws grazed her skin, she closed her eyes, waiting for the end. Still, deep in the absolute silence of her soul, a tiny cold spark remained. It wasn't the golden light of the air, and it wasn't the silver light of her wolf. Rather, it was the black, obsidian void of a shadow wolf who had nothing left to lose. Truth be told, the king had made a mistake. He had emptied her of her love, but he had forgotten to empty her of her rage. What followed was the quietest sound in the world, the sound of a heart stopping and then starting again with a rhythm that didn't belong to a human or a wolf. It was the rhythm of a vengeful ghost. Zara's eyes snapped open, but they weren't gold anymore. They were black. Because of the betrayal, like the assassin was gone, and something far more dangerous had taken her place. The Vulture King's laughter died in his throat as Zara's fingers clamped around his wrist. Because she had been emptied of all light, there was nothing left to siphon but the cold, hungry void of a shadow wolf's vengeance. Her eyes were no longer the gold of a mate. They were two pits of endless black that seemed to drink the moonlight. Still, her body felt lighter than air, as if the darkness itself was lifting her off the blood-soaked ground. Soon after, a low, subsonic vibration began to hum through the air, shaking the bone throne until it cracked. Zara didn't shift into a wolf. Rather, she became a phantom, her skin turning into a swirling mist of silver and shadow. What followed was a moment of pure, heart-stopping terror for the rogues surrounding her. I'm in a single heartbeat, the world shifted. Zara felt the bond with Zaya snap back into place, but this time she wasn't sent in pain. Because she was now the source of the void, she sent a wave of absolute silence that shattered the king's mental lash. You took my light, Zara's voice echoed, sounding like 1,000 ghosts speaking at once. Now I will take your air. In that moment, she realized the truth. Her internal flaw of being a tool had been her shield. By letting the king drain her, she had lured him into a psychic trap. Before he could move, Zara pushed her hand into the king's chest. Her touch wasn't hot like Malachi's. It was the freezing cold of the space between stars. In the echo of her voice, the king's eyes widened as the violet light he had stolen began to turn into a suffocating black soot. Next, the turning point from despair became a roaring fire of determination. Zara turned her head toward Malachi, who was still pinned under a mountain of gray fur. Without thinking, she projected her new power outward, a shock wave of shadow that sent the rogues flying like dry leaves in a storm. Malachi surged to his feet, his obsidian fur bristling with a mix of awe and primal fear. Even so, he recognized the soul behind the black eyes. His own roar joined hers in a terrifying duet of power. Because she was his mate, he didn't fear her darkness. He fed it with his own strength. Moments later, Zara stood before Zaya's pillar, her fingers turning into claws as she sliced through the iron chains like they were made of silk. She caught her sister before she hit the ground. Zaya's eyes fluttered open, the vacant look replaced by a spark of recognition. Because they were twins, Zaya didn't fear the darkness. She reached out and touched Zara's cheek. Her own strength began to return as the void balanced their shared soul. We fight together, Zara whispered, her voice finally steady. What followed was the birth of a new plan. Zara realized that the shadow heir wasn't dead. It was just waiting for the dark to pass. She felt a rhythmic thrum in her womb, a drumbeat of war that signaled the child's survival. Rather than hiding, she turned to face Vayne and the remaining traitors. Because she was a queen, she didn't need a crown. She had the loyalty of the shadows themselves. She was the hunter. She was the shadow. She was the end. Looking back, looking. I should have known that the dark was where I was strongest. Zara called out to the remaining pack warriors. What would you have done? Would you have followed a king who eats his own, or a queen who feeds the pack? As the wind shifted, the momentum of the battle turned entirely toward the Obsidian pack. Malachi reached her side, his massive head pressing against her shoulder in a silent vow of support. He was a mountain. He was a shield. He was home. Together, they turned toward the Vulture King, who was scrambling to regroup his broken ones for a final desperate stand. What's worse, the king had one last trick. He began to shift, but the transformation was a grotesque, painful mess of bone and rotting feathers. He became a monstrosity of shadow and filth, a giant crow wolf that towered over the clearing. Because he was desperate, he began to drain the life force of his own soldiers to fuel his growth. To make things worse, the air became so thick with rot that the warriors on both sides began to gag. The journey ends here, the king screamed, his voice a jagged tear in the fabric of the night. Without another word, Zara led the charge. She ran as a woman, but moved with the speed of a wolf, her silver mist form leaving a trail of frost in the dirt. Behind her, Malachi and the loyal Obsidian warriors moved as a single, unstoppable wave of black fur. The space between them burned with a resolve that no trap could break. Beneath the moonlight, Zara leaped into the air, her hand glowing with that strange, secondary source of power. It was the Shadow Heir's first gift, a blade of pure solidified darkness. As she descended toward the king's throat, and she knew this was the moment of direct confrontation. The open loop of her identity was finally closing. She was the one sent to take a life, and tonight she would take the only one that mattered. The shadow blade in Zara's hand hummed with the collective rage of every outcast the Vulture King had ever broken. As she descended from the moonlit sky, the air thickened until it felt like liquid lead. Because the king had siphoned the light from her, he expected a hollow shell. Instead, he met a supernova of darkness. The moment their eyes locked, the king tried to lunge, but his movements were sluggish under the weight of the Shadow Heir's aura. Without thinking, Zara struck. The blade didn't draw blood. It drew the very essence of the rot that held the king together. And what followed was a scream that wasn't human or wolf, a sound of ancient glass shattering in a vacuum. In a single heartbeat, the world shifted. The king's monstrous form began to dissolve into black sand, the stolen life force bleeding back into the forest. Zara landed lightly on her feet, her black eyes slowly fading back to their natural gold. Beside her, Malachi was a blur of obsidian fury, his claws finishing the work by tearing the king's physical heart from his chest. Still, the victory wasn't complete until the king's body vanished into the wind, leaving nothing behind but a pile of rusted chains. Because she was now the queen of both light and shadow, she felt the forest sigh in relief. "It's over," Zara whispered, her voice trembling as the adrenaline began to ebb. What's worse, the broken ones stood frozen. Their master gone, and their minds suddenly clear of the violet fog. Rather than continuing the slaughter, Malachi let out a low, deep-throated howl that signaled an end to the bloodletting. The war was over. The nightmare of the dead thicket had finally been put to rest. Next, the reconstruction of the pack began under the light of a new dawn. By the time the sun began to peek over the obsidian crags, the battlefield was quiet. Zara sat on a mossy stone, her head resting on Malachi's shoulder, while Zaya sat on her other side. They were a trio of survivors, wrapped in the cold morning mist. Because she had used the void, Zara felt a profound exhaustion in her bones, but the flicker of life in her womb was stronger than ever. Moments later, the pack warriors began to gather around them. Vane was nowhere to be found, having fled into the shadows the moment the king fell. Truth be told, the pack looked different now. The suspicion was gone, replaced by a solemn, deep rooted awe. They didn't see an assassin anymore. They saw the woman who had walked into the dark to bring back the light. Because she had saved their alpha, they finally saw her as their own. Soon after, they began the long climb back to the castle. As the silence roared, Zara looked at the warriors who had once snarled at her. One by one, they dipped their heads as she passed. Because she had fed them hope when they were starving for it, they finally accepted her as their Luna. The open loops of the pack's judgment were closing, tied shut by the blood they had shed together. She was their savior. She was their leader. She was their queen. That night, months later, like the Obsidian Crags were no longer a place of jagged fear, but a sanctuary of life. Zara stood on the high balcony of the stone palace, the wind carrying the scent of cedar and pine. She was no longer thin or haunted. Rather, she was radiant, her belly now a heavy, beautiful weight that spoke of a fast approaching future. Looking back, I should have known that my sister wasn't my only tether, Zara said softly as Zaya walked onto the balcony. Zaya looked healthy, her skin glowing and her eyes bright. She was the pack's new healer, using her sensitivity to help others rather than being a victim to it. Because they were twins, they still felt each other, but now the bond transmitted only peace. Not only that, but the dead thicket was already beginning to grow new green shoots. The curse of the vulture king having been lifted from the land. He's coming, Zaya teased, pointing toward the forest below. As if summoned, a massive black wolf emerged from the tree line, a large deer draped over his shoulders. Malachi shifted mid-stride, his human form appearing with a grace that still made Zara's pulse race. He looked up at the balcony, his golden eyes locking onto hers with a burning, intense fire that had only grown with time. "Come down, my queen." His voice floated up to her, deep and full of a love that was no longer complicated by secrets. Zara smiled, her soul answering his call with a joy that was entirely her own. She was the one sent to take a life. Instead, she had saved a kingdom. She had found a sister. She had claimed a mate. Most importantly, she had found herself. She had found a sister. She had claimed a mate. She had found herself. That night, item under a moon that shone like a silver coin, a new cry echoed through the Obsidian Crags. It was a strong, healthy sound, the cry of the shadow heir. As Malachi held their son and Zaya stood by the hearth, Zara realized that the bond was no longer a chain. Because she had chosen to love, it was now a circle of protection. And in this circle, they were finally, truly free.